Millionaire marries overweight woman for a bet and despairs when he discovers what she hides. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany-panelled walls of the prestigious Savile Club in London's Mayfair district. Alexander Alex Sterling, age 35, sat in his usual leather armchair, swirling a glass of 25-year-old Macallan whiskey while his steel-blue eyes studied the financial reports on his tablet. As the CEO of Sterling Enterprises, one of Britain's largest real estate development companies, he had built his fortune by being ruthlessly efficient in his business dealings. "Another acquisition?" questioned James Hartford, his closest friend since their days at Oxford, settling into the adjacent chair with his own drink. "You're becoming predictable, old chap." Alex's perfectly tailored Savile Row suit shifted slightly as he leaned back, a confident smirk playing across his classically handsome features. "Predictably successful, you mean? The Brighton Marina development will add another 100 million to our portfolio. And how many small businesses will you displace this time?" James asked, his tone carrying an edge that Alex chose to ignore. "It's business, James. Nothing personal." Alex set down his tablet and gestured toward a striking woman at the bar. "Speaking of personal matters, Victoria and I have decided to part ways." James raised an eyebrow. "The supermodel? Let me guess. She wasn't quite perfect enough?" "She had a slight asymmetry in her smile," Alex replied, without a hint of irony. "You know my standards." James shook his head, a mixture of amusement and disapproval crossing his features. "Your standards are becoming infamous, Alex. When was the last time you dated someone who didn't step off a magazine cover? Why should I settle? I've earned the right to be selective." Alex's tone was dismissive, but James noticed a fleeting shadow of loneliness cross his friend's face. "Selective? More like superficial," James challenged. "You judge everything and everyone by their appearance or net worth? I bet you couldn't last a year with someone who didn't fit your precious standards." Alex's eyes narrowed. "Care to make that interesting?" James leaned forward, suddenly intrigued. "What did you have in mind?" "Name your terms," Alex replied, his competitive nature fully engaged. James took a thoughtful sip of his drink, then smiled slowly. "Marry someone who completely defies your usual type, someone who wouldn't turn heads at all your fancy galas. Stay married for 1 full year, treating her with genuine respect and consideration. And what do I get when I win?" Alex's emphasis on when made James roll his eyes. £10 million, James stated flatly. "But I get to choose the bride." Alex nearly choked on his whiskey. "10 million, you're serious?" "Deadly." James pulled out his phone. "In fact, I already have someone in mind. Remember my cousin's charity organization. One of their event coordinators would be perfect." Alex's curiosity was piqued. "Show me." James pulled up a photo on his phone and slid it across the table. Alex's eyes widened as he looked at the image of a woman in her early 30s, considerably overweight, with plain features and wearing practical, unfashionable clothes. "Her name is Emma Clark," James explained. "She's brilliant, kind, and completely genuine. Everything you typically avoid." Alex stared at the photo longer than necessary, his jaw tightening. "And if I succeed? If I marry her and stay married for a year? Then you get the money, and more importantly, you might actually learn something about yourself." James extended his hand. "Do we have a deal?" Alex glanced once more at the photo, then grasped James's hand firmly. "Deal, but I have one condition. She has to agree of her own free will. I won't force anyone into marriage, even for £10 million. "Agreed," James nodded, a glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. "I'll arrange an introduction at the charity gala next week. Just remember, this isn't one of your hostile takeovers. She's a person, not a property to acquire." As they shook hands, neither man noticed the slight tremor in Alex's usually steady grip, nor the way his eyes kept drifting back to Emma's photo. Something about her warm smile and kind eyes stirred an unexpected feeling of curiosity in him, though he quickly dismissed it as the effects of the whiskey. Little did Alex know that this wager would set in motion events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about value, worth, and love. As he left the club that evening, stepping into the cool London air, he couldn't shake the feeling that he might have just made either the biggest mistake of his life, or perhaps, though he wouldn't admit it even to himself, the best decision he'd ever made. Emma Clark stood before her bedroom mirror in her modest flat in South London, scrutinizing her reflection with a mixture of determination and apprehension. The invitation to the upcoming charity gala lay on her dresser, its gold-embossed lettering catching the morning light. As the event coordinator for the Hope Foundation, she had organized countless such gatherings, but this one felt different. This time, she had an ulterior motive. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, smoothing down the fabric of her most professional outfit. A navy blue dress that, while not exactly fashionable, was the best she could afford on her modest salary. Her fingers traced the worn silver locket around her neck, the only remaining piece of jewelry from better days. The sound of her mobile phone ringing startled her from her thoughts. It was James Hartford, her cousin's friend, and one of the foundation's most generous donors. "Emma, darling, are you ready for next week's gala?" His voice carried an unusual note of excitement. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Though I still think it's odd you specifically requested me to attend, rather than just coordinate from behind the scenes as usual. Trust me, Emma. You need to be there. In fact, there's someone I'd like you to meet." James paused. "Alexander Sterling will be attending." Emma's heart skipped a beat at the mention of that name, though she managed to keep her voice neutral. "The real estate developer? The one who's always in the society pages?" "The very same, and he's recently single again." Emma sank onto her bed, her free hand clutching the locket tighter. Inside was a faded photograph of her father, standing proudly in front of Clark's Books and Antiques, the family business that had been in their family for 3 generations, until Sterling Enterprises had acquired the building and tripled the rent, forcing them into bankruptcy. "James," she began carefully, "why are you telling me this? Let's just say I think you and Alex might have more in common than you'd expect. He needs to meet someone real, someone genuine, someone like you." Emma closed her eyes, remembering the day they'd had to close the shop, her father's defeated expression as he turned the key in the lock for the last time. The way his spirit had seemed to diminish with each passing day afterward. Now he lived in a tiny flat in Manchester, barely making ends meet as a night watchman. "I appreciate the thought, James, but someone like Alexander Sterling wouldn't look twice at someone like me." She tried to inject just the right amount of self-deprecation into her voice. "Don't sell yourself short, Emma. You're brilliant, compassionate, and far more capable than you give yourself credit for. Just give it a chance." "For me." After ending the call, Emma walked to her small home office, pulling out a worn folder from her desk drawer. Inside were newspaper clippings about Sterling Enterprises' various developments, including the one that had changed her family's life forever. She had tracked Alexander Sterling's career meticulously over the past few years, learning everything she could about the man who had, albeit indirectly, destroyed her father's legacy. Her laptop screen showed the latest article about him, Sterling Enterprises CEO named Bachelor of the Year. The photo showed him at some glamorous event, his aristocratic features set in that characteristic expression of superior detachment she had come to recognize from countless society page photographs. Emma sat down at her desk and began to write in her journal, something she'd done every day since their shop had closed. "Dear Dad, it seems an opportunity has finally presented itself. James doesn't know about our connection to Sterling, of course. No one does. But perhaps this is the chance we've been waiting for. Not for revenge. You taught me better than that. But for justice, for understanding, for making him see the real impact of his business decisions on people's lives. I know you wouldn't approve of deception, but sometimes the end justifies the means. And if there's even a chance I can make Alexander Sterling understand what his actions do to families like ours, maybe I can prevent it from happening to others." She closed the journal and looked at her reflection again in the small mirror on her desk. She saw what others saw, an overweight, ordinary woman who would never turn heads at the fancy events someone like Alexander Sterling frequented. But she also saw her father's determination in her eyes, her mother's strength in her jaw. Standing up, Emma walked to her wardrobe and pulled out the dress she'd been saving for a special occasion. It wasn't designer, but it was elegant in its own way. She'd need to look her best for the gala, need to be perfect in her own imperfect way. Because this wasn't just about meeting Alexander Sterling anymore. This was about giving a voice to all the small business owners who had been crushed under the weight of his corporate empire. As she hung the dress on her door, Emma felt a mix of guilt and resolve. She wasn't proud of the deception she was about to undertake, but sometimes life didn't give you the luxury of perfect choices. And if James was inadvertently giving her the opportunity to get close to Alexander Sterling, she would take it. Little did she know that she wasn't the only one with an ulterior motive for their upcoming meeting, nor that the path she was about to embark upon would lead to consequences far beyond anything she could have imagined. The Dorchester's ballroom sparkled with the kind of opulence that Alexander Sterling took for granted. Crystal glasses clinked, designer dresses rustled, and the soft strains of a string quartet floated through the air. He adjusted his bow tie, scanning the room with practiced indifference until James appeared at his elbow. "Ready to meet her?" James asked, barely concealing his anticipation. Alex took a long sip of champagne. "Let's get this over with." Across the room, Emma stood near one of the elaborate floral arrangements she'd helped select, her heart thundering in her chest. The dress she'd chosen, a deep burgundy evening gown with subtle beading, was the most expensive thing she'd bought in years. She'd spent hours practicing how to carry herself, how to speak, how to hide her true feelings behind a mask of polite interest. "Emma, darling," James called out, leading Alex toward her. "I'd like you to meet my dear friend, Alexander Sterling." The moment stretched like pulled taffy as their eyes met. Alex's practiced smile flickered almost imperceptibly as he took in her appearance. Emma felt his appraising gaze like a physical touch, noting the slight tightening around his mouth, the way his shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Clark," he said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "James has told me absolutely nothing about you." Emma's answering smile was careful, measured. "And he's told me far too much about you, Mr. Sterling." James laughed, clapping Alex on the shoulder. "I'll leave you two to get acquainted. Emma's doing remarkable work with our youth education initiatives." As James melted into the crowd, an awkward silence descended. Alex shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but bound by social courtesy to continue the conversation. "So," he began, "youth education." "Yes," Emma replied, warming to the subject despite herself. "We're working to provide opportunities for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Many of them have lost their family businesses or homes due to economic changes in their neighborhoods." She watched his face carefully as she spoke, but his expression remained impassive. "Progress is inevitable," he said smoothly. "Change is the nature of business. Is it progress when families lose their livelihoods?" The words slipped out before she could stop them, sharper than she'd intended. Alex's eyebrows rose slightly. "You seem to have strong opinions about business for someone in the charity sector, and you seem to have strong opinions about progress for someone who's never had to worry about losing everything." Emma immediately bit her lip, cursing her quick tongue. To her surprise, instead of being offended, Alex looked intrigued. "You're not what I expected," he said, studying her with new interest. "Let me guess, you expected someone more deferential?" Emma met his gaze steadily. "I expected someone boring," he admitted, then had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "That came out wrong." "Did it?" Emma's laugh was genuine despite herself. "No, I think it came out exactly as you meant it." They fell into an odd rhythm of conversation, trading subtle barbs wrapped in polite small talk. Emma found herself both repelled by his arrogance and fascinated by the occasional glimpses of something deeper, a flash of loneliness, a moment of self-awareness quickly masked. Alex, for his part, was surprised to find himself engaged in the conversation. Her quick wit and unflinching honesty were refreshing after years of sycophantic socialites. Even her appearance, which he'd initially dismissed, held a certain appeal. Her eyes sparkled when she was passionate about a topic, and her smile, when genuine, transformed her entire face. "Would you have dinner with me tomorrow night?" he asked suddenly, surprising them both. Emma's heart raced. This was happening faster than she'd expected. "Why?" "Because you obviously think I'm a terrible person, and I find myself wanting to change your mind." She studied him for a long moment. "Okay," she said finally, "but I choose the restaurant." "Deal." He pulled out his phone to exchange numbers, not noticing the way her hands trembled slightly as she typed hers in. As they parted ways for the evening, both felt the weight of their secrets. Alex couldn't tell her about the bet that had prompted his invitation, and Emma couldn't reveal her connection to one of his past business dealings. Yet, something real had sparked between them, something neither had anticipated. James watched from across the room, sipping his whiskey with a satisfied smile. Everything was going according to plan, though perhaps not exactly the plan he'd originally had in mind. He'd seen the way they'd looked at each other, the genuine engagement in their conversation. Maybe this wager would end up being about more than just money or pride. As Emma left the gala that night, she felt torn between her original purpose and the unexpected complexity of her feelings. Alexander Sterling wasn't exactly what she'd expected. Yes, he was arrogant and privileged, but there were cracks in that perfect facade, hints of a real person beneath the polished surface. In his penthouse later that night, Alex found himself staring at her contact information in his phone. The bet suddenly felt less important than his genuine curiosity about this woman who'd challenged him so directly. He hadn't expected to enjoy their conversation, hadn't expected to find himself actually looking forward to seeing her again. Neither of them slept well that night, both wondering if they were in over their heads, both questioning their motives, and both trying to ignore the unexpected flutter of anticipation about what tomorrow might bring. Emma had chosen a small family-owned Italian restaurant in Notting Hill, far from the Michelin-starred establishments Alexander Sterling typically frequented. As she waited outside, watching his sleek Aston Martin pull up to the curb, she couldn't help but smile at his barely concealed dismay. "This is quaint," Alex said as he emerged from his car, taking in the cheerful red and white checkered tablecloths visible through the window. "Luigi's has been here for 30 years, Emma replied. "The same family has owned it since they immigrated from Naples. They make the best carbonara in London." Alex held the door for her, noticing how the elderly owner greeted Emma by name and with a warm embrace. The restaurant was busy, but not crowded, filled with the happy chatter of regular customers and the rich aroma of garlic and fresh herbs. "Emma Bella." Luigi himself approached their table, his lined face creased with genuine pleasure. "And you bring a new friend, yes?" "This is Alexander," Emma said, watching as Luigi's weathered hand engulfed Alex's perfectly manicured one in a hearty handshake. "Ah, you are in for a treat, Signor. I make everything special tonight." Luigi winked at Emma before disappearing into the kitchen. Alex looked around, taking in the family photos on the walls, the mismatched chairs, the way every table seemed to hold people who knew each other well. It was so different from his usual haunts, where privacy and exclusivity were prized above all else. "You seem uncomfortable," Emma observed, unfolding her napkin. "Not uncomfortable," Alex corrected. "Just out of my element." "That's rather the point." Emma's eyes held his. "Sometimes we need to step out of our comfort zones to see things differently." The wine Luigi brought wasn't on any prestigious list, but it was rich and full-bodied, made by his cousin's vineyard in Tuscany. The food came in generous portions, served family-style on platters meant for sharing. As they ate, their conversation flowed more easily than either had expected. Emma told him about growing up in a small town outside Manchester, carefully avoiding any mention of her father's bookshop. Alex found himself sharing stories about his early days in business, including some of his failures, something he rarely discussed. "So what made you choose charity work?" he asked, twirling perfect strands of pasta around his fork. Emma paused, choosing her words carefully. "I believe in helping people who've been displaced by circumstances beyond their control. Sometimes all someone needs is a second chance." "But isn't that just enabling failure?" Alex countered. "In business, you either adapt or you fail. It's natural selection." "Is it natural when the playing field isn't level?" Emma's voice held an edge. "When large corporations can simply outlast smaller businesses through sheer financial power?" Alex studied her face, noting the passion in her expression. "You speak as if this is personal." "It is personal," she replied softly. "Every family business that closes, every community that's disrupted, it's all personal to someone." Before Alex could respond, Luigi appeared with dessert, a tiramisu he insisted they share. As they both reached for their spoons, their hands brushed briefly, sending an unexpected current through both of them. "You know," Alex said after a moment, "I've never actually asked the people affected by my developments how they felt about the changes." "Maybe you should start," Emma suggested, her heart beating faster at this small admission. As the evening drew to a close, they found themselves walking along the quiet streets of Notting Hill. The autumn air was crisp, and Emma wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself. Without thinking, Alex shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, surprised by the gesture. The jacket was warm and carried the subtle scent of his cologne. "Emma," he began, then hesitated. "Would you consider seeing me again?" She looked up at him, studying his face in the lamplight. For once his usual mask of confidence had slipped, revealing something more vulnerable underneath. "Why?" she asked. "I'm clearly not your usual type." "Maybe that's exactly why," he replied honestly. "You challenge me. You make me think about things I usually ignore. It's refreshing." Emma felt her carefully constructed walls wavering. This wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to enjoy his company, wasn't supposed to feel this flutter in her chest when he looked at her like that. "Yes," she found herself saying, "I'd like to see you again." As they said goodbye, both felt the weight of their secrets growing heavier. Alex's hand lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary, and Emma fought the urge to confess everything right there. Later that night in his penthouse, Alex called James. "How was dinner?" James asked, amusement evident in his voice. "It was educational," Alex replied, still processing the evening. "She's unlike anyone I've ever met." "That was rather the point, old chap." After hanging up, Alex walked to his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the London skyline. For the first time, he found himself wondering about the stories behind each glowing window, the lives affected by his business decisions. In her flat, Emma sat at her desk, her journal open before her. She began to write, then stopped, torn between her original purpose and the unexpected reality of Alexander Sterling. He wasn't just the corporate villain she'd imagined. He was a complex person capable of surprise, of change, of genuine connection. Both of them lay awake that night, their thoughts filled with each other, their hearts struggling with the weight of unspoken truths. Neither could have predicted how one simple dinner would begin to shift their perspectives, challenging everything they thought they knew about each other and themselves. Over the next few weeks, Alexander Sterling's carefully ordered world began to tilt on its axis. His usual haunts, exclusive clubs, five-star restaurants, luxury hotels, suddenly felt hollow compared to the places Emma introduced him to. She showed him a London he'd never known existed, a city pulsing with real life, rather than manufactured exclusivity. One particularly memorable Saturday, she convinced him to join her at a local farmer's market in Borough Market. Alex stood out conspicuously in his casual wear that still probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Try this," Emma said, offering him a piece of artisanal cheese from a small family vendor. "I usually have my chef source my cheese from—" He stopped at her raised eyebrow. "Fine." He tasted it, his eyes widening in surprise. "This is extraordinary." The elderly cheesemaker beamed. "Family recipe, been making it the same way for 40 years. Until the new development forces us out next month," his wife added quietly, her weathered face falling. Alex froze. "What development?" "Sterling Enterprises bought the building," the woman explained, not realizing who she was talking to. "They're turning it into luxury flats. The rent's tripling for all the market vendors." Emma watched Alex's face carefully, seeing the conflict play across his features. He pulled out his phone, stepping away to make a call. "Jenkins?" "Yes. The Borough Market development. I want all the details on my desk Monday morning. And hold off on any eviction notices until further notice." When he returned, Emma was pretending she hadn't been listening. "Everything all right?" "Just business," he replied distractedly. But she noticed him looking around the market with new eyes, seeing not just quaint shops but people's livelihoods. Later that afternoon, they sat on a bench in nearby Southwark Park, sharing a paper bag of fresh pastries from the market. "You're different when you're away from your corporate world," Emma observed, brushing custard from her lip. Alex watched the gesture, momentarily distracted. Different how? More real, more human. She turned to face him. "Why did you really ask me out that night at the gala?" The question caught him off guard. The truth about the bet stuck in his throat, especially now that he was beginning to care about her opinion of him. "I told you, you intrigued me," he said instead, hating how the partial truth felt like a complete lie. Emma studied his face, her own secret weighing heavily. "And now?" "Now," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Now I find myself looking forward to our time together more than anything else in my day." The sincerity in his voice made her heart twist. She watched a family playing nearby, a father pushing his daughter on the swing, and thought of her own father still struggling to rebuild his life. "Alex," she began, then stopped. "Have you ever regretted any of your business decisions?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I used to think business and personal feelings should never mix. That sentiment was weakness." He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, mussing it slightly. "But lately I've been wondering if I've been wrong about a lot of things." Emma felt tears threatening and blinked them away. This wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to see him change, wasn't supposed to care about his journey of self-discovery. "There's something I need to tell you," they both said simultaneously, then laughed nervously. Before either could continue, Alex's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and frowned. "It's James. He wants to meet for drinks tonight. Something about checking on the progress of our arrangement." Emma's smile faltered slightly. "Arrangement? Just some business matter," Alex said quickly, but his discomfort was palpable. "Rain check on dinner?" She nodded, grateful for the reprieve from what she'd almost confessed. As they parted ways, both felt the weight of their secrets growing heavier with each passing day. That evening at his private club, Alex faced James across their usual table. "Well?" James prompted. "It's been almost a month. How's our little wager progressing?" Alex took a large swallow of whiskey. "I'm calling it off." "The bet? Why?" "Because—" Alex struggled to find the words. "Because she deserves better than to be part of some game. She's changed how I see things, James. The market development we discussed last quarter, I'm restructuring it to maintain the current tenants at their existing rates." James leaned back, a satisfied smile playing at his lips. "Well, well, it seems Emma's having quite an effect on you." "This isn't about Emma," Alex protested, but they both knew it was a lie. "It's about realizing that success doesn't always have to mean someone else fails." Meanwhile, Emma sat in her flat, staring at her father's old ledger books spread across her desk. The pages were filled with neat columns showing the steady decline of their family business after Sterling Enterprises had acquired the building. She traced her finger over her father's increasingly desperate notes about rising rents and falling sales. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm sorry, but I think I'm falling for him." She closed the ledger and walked to her window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Alex was probably sitting in his exclusive club, perhaps already planning their next date. The thought brought both joy and guilt. The time was coming when they would both have to face the truth, but for now they were caught in a dance of half-truths and growing feelings, each step bringing them closer to both revelation and potential heartbreak. The autumn gala season was in full swing, and for the first time in his life, Alexander Sterling found himself attending these events with genuine anticipation rather than obligation. Emma had become his constant companion, her presence transforming tedious social obligations into opportunities for shared amusement at the aristocracy's pretensions. Tonight's event was the annual Real Estate Developers Association dinner, held in the magnificent Victorian ballroom of the Langham. Emma wore a deep emerald gown that Alex had insisted on buying her, though she'd only accepted after he agreed to match the cost with a donation to her youth education program. Sterling. Alex stiffened as Richard Blackwood approached, a property developer known for his particularly aggressive business tactics. Emma felt Alex's hand tighten protectively around her waist. "Blackwood," Alex nodded coolly. "You remember Emma Clark?" Blackwood's eyes swept over Emma dismissively. "Yes, the charity worker. Though I must say, Sterling, she's quite a departure from your usual companions." Emma felt Alex bristle beside her, but before he could respond, she spoke up. "Mr. Blackwood, I believe you were involved in the Merchants Row development in Manchester a few years ago." "Indeed," Blackwood preened. "Turned that run-down street of failing shops into luxury apartments. Tripled the property value." "And the local businesses," Emma pressed, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The ones that had been there for generations." "Progress requires sacrifice," Blackwood dismissed with a wave of his hand. "You can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs." Alex watched Emma's face carefully, noting the controlled anger in her expression. "Actually," he interrupted, "I've been reviewing some of our development strategies. There are ways to modernize while preserving local businesses. It's not just about the bottom line." Blackwood stared at him as if he'd grown a second head. Good God, Sterling. She's really gotten to you, hasn't she? What happened to sentiment is the enemy of success. I was wrong, Alex stated firmly, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. Community matters. People matter. Emma looked up at him, her heart doing strange flips in her chest. This was the man she'd been hoping to create when she'd agreed to James's scheme, but now that he was here, the guilt of her deception felt overwhelming. Alex, she began, there's something I need to tell you. Sterling. James's voice cut through the moment as he approached their group, slightly unsteady from champagne. How's our little arrangement working out? Coming up on 2 months now, isn't it? Emma felt Alex go very still beside her. Arrangement? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. James continued, oblivious to the tension. Best bet I ever made, though I must say, old chap. You're taking it far more seriously than I expected, actually seeming to care about... James, Alex cut him off sharply, but the damage was done. Emma stepped back, her face pale. Bet? What bet? The silence that fell between them was deafening. Alex reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Emma, please, let me explain. Just explain what? Her voice was unnaturally calm. That I was some sort of wager, a challenge to be conquered. It's not like that anymore, Alex insisted. Yes, it started as a bet, but everything changed. You changed me. Emma laughed, but it was a hollow sound. Changed you? Into what? Someone who can lie more convincingly. Blackwood watched the scene unfold with obvious amusement. Oh, this is rich. The great Alexander Sterling, brought low by a charity case. What was the bet exactly? Shut up, Blackwood, Alex snapped, but Emma had already turned away, heading for the exit. He caught up with her in the lobby, grabbing her arm gently. Emma, please. What I feel for you is real. She turned to face him, tears glinting in her eyes. How much? What? The bet. How much was I worth? Alex's silence was answer enough. Emma pulled her arm free, her voice shaking. You know what the worst part is? I actually believed you were changing. I started to think that maybe... She stopped, composing herself. Thank you for showing me exactly what I'm worth to you. Emma, don't. She held up a hand. Just don't. As she walked away, Alex stood frozen in the opulent lobby, watching the best thing that had ever happened to him disappear through the revolving doors. Behind him, he could hear James trying to apologize, Blackwood's mocking laughter, but none of it mattered. In the taxi home, Emma finally let her tears fall. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. She had entered this arrangement with her own ulterior motives, her own deception, but somewhere along the way, the pretense had become real, and the truth about Alex's bet felt like a physical blow. She pulled out her father's locket, looking at the old photograph inside. I'm sorry, Dad, she whispered. I failed at getting justice for you, and I failed at protecting my own heart. Back at the gala, Alex stood at the bar, ignoring James's attempts at conversation. He stared into his whiskey, seeing Emma's face in every amber reflection. He had started this as a game, but somewhere between the farmer's market cheese and the way she challenged his every assumption, he had fallen in love with her. And now, because of his pride and his silence, he might have lost her forever. Neither of them slept that night, both wrestling with their own guilt and pain, both knowing that the worst revelations were still to come. The week following the gala passed in a blur of missed calls and unanswered messages. Alex threw himself into work with renewed intensity, but everything reminded him of Emma. The morning staff meeting featured a proposal for another local development, and all he could think about was the elderly couple at the farmer's market. Even his morning coffee from his usual premium roaster tasted bitter compared to the simple brew from the corner cafe Emma had introduced him to. In her flat, Emma wasn't faring much better. She'd called in sick to the foundation, unable to face the possibility of running into James. Her journal lay open on her desk, pages filled with increasingly conflicted entries. The sound of her phone ringing startled her. It was her father. Emma, love, are you all right? You missed our weekly call. Her father's gentle voice broke something inside her. Oh, Dad, she whispered, tears starting again. What's wrong? Has something happened? Emma looked at the newspaper clipping on her desk, a yellowed article about Sterling Enterprises' acquisition of their building. I met someone, she began carefully. Someone I thought was different than he appeared. Someone I thought I could change. This wouldn't happen to be Alexander Sterling, would it? Emma sat up straight. "How did you—" "James called me," her father said softly. "He's worried about you. Told me everything about the bet, and how Sterling's been acting differently since meeting you. Dad, I'm so sorry, I should have told you. I thought if I could get close to him, make him understand what his business decisions do to people like us." "Emma Jean Clark," her father's voice was firm but gentle. "Did you fall in love with him?" The question hung in the air. "I thought I was pretending," she whispered finally, "but somewhere along the way it became real." "And does he love you?" "He says he does. But Dad, he only pursued me because of a bet. £10 million to marry someone who didn't meet his usual standards." Her father was quiet for a moment. "You know, when your mother and I first met, I was trying to win a dare." "What?" "My university mates bet me I couldn't get the prettiest girl on campus to go out with me. I tried every smooth line I knew, but your mother saw right through me. When I finally confessed about the dare, she laughed and said she'd known all along. Said she agreed to date me anyway because she saw something in me worth believing in." Emma wiped her eyes. "That's different, Dad." "Is it? People can surprise you, love. Sometimes the worst reasons can lead to the best outcomes." After hanging up, Emma walked to her window watching the London rain. Her father's words echoed in her mind, mixing with memories of Alex's genuine laughter at Luigi's, his quiet determination when he'd called off the market development, the way his eyes had softened when he looked at her. Meanwhile, across town, Alex sat in his office staring at the borough market development plans. He'd spent the morning rewriting the entire proposal, ensuring all current tenants could maintain their locations at affordable rates. His secretary had looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. Or maybe, for the first time, he was thinking clearly. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was James. "You look terrible," James observed, taking in Alex's rumpled appearance. "What do you want?" "To apologize and to tell you you're being an idiot." Alex raised an eyebrow. "You love her," James stated simply, "and you're letting your pride stop you from fighting for her. She won't answer my calls. Then stop calling and do something grand. You're Alexander Sterling, for God's sake. Since when do you give up on something you want?" Alex stood up, pacing. "It's not that simple. I betrayed her trust." "Yes, you did," James agreed. "And now you have to prove that what started as a bet became something real. Show her the changes she's inspired aren't just about her, but about who you've become." After James left, Alex sat at his desk pulling up file after file of past developments. Each one represented families displaced, communities disrupted. Emma had made him see the human cost of his success, and now he had to prove it. He picked up his phone, not to call Emma, but his lawyer. "Jenkins? I need you to draw up new papers for every property we've acquired in the past 5 years. We're implementing a new community preservation initiative." As he hung up, his eye caught a familiar name in one of the old files. Clark's Books and Antiques, Manchester. The shop had been part of a larger development 3 years ago. He clicked the file open, scanning the details. His blood ran cold. The shop had been owned by one Thomas Clark, who had operated it for 30 years before being forced out by rising rents after Sterling Enterprises acquired the building. The shop had closed permanently 6 months later. Thomas Clark's daughter was listed as a co-owner, Emma Clark. Alex sat back, the weight of understanding crushing him. She had known. All along, she had known exactly who he was and what he'd done to her family. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They had both entered this relationship with ulterior motives, both hidden behind masks of deception. But somewhere amid the lies, something true had grown. He stood up, grabbing his coat. He knew where she would be. It was Wednesday evening, and despite everything, he knew she never missed her weekly volunteer shift at the community center. It was time for both of them to face the truth, all of it, no matter the cost. The community center buzzed with its usual Wednesday evening activity. Children's laughter echoed from the homework club room, while the smell of homemade soup wafted from the kitchen, where volunteers prepared meals for the elderly. Emma stood in her usual spot, helping a young girl with her mathematics homework, when she felt the atmosphere in the room shift. Alex stood in the doorway, his normally impeccable appearance slightly disheveled, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart skip. In his hand, he held a familiar-looking folder, one she recognized from her father's old business records. "Emma," he said softly, but his voice carried across the room. "We need to talk." She looked down at the young girl. "Sarah, why don't you take a break? Get some juice from the kitchen." As the room cleared, leaving them alone, Emma stood her ground. "There's nothing to talk about." "Clark's Books and Antiques," Alex said, opening the folder. "Established 1960 by George Clark, passed down to his son Thomas Clark in 1985. Forced to close in 2021 after Sterling Enterprises acquired the building and tripled the rent." He looked up at her. "Your father's shop." Emma's hands gripped the back of a chair, her knuckles white. "So now you know. Why didn't you tell me? Would it have mattered?" Her laugh was bitter. "When you made that bet with James, when you decided to pursue me like some kind of challenge to be conquered, would knowing about my father have changed anything?" "You're right," Alex admitted, taking a step closer. "It wouldn't have mattered then, but it matters now. Everything matters now. Because you feel guilty? Because I love you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth and regret. "You pursued me for a bet," Emma said, her voice shaking. £10 million to marry someone who didn't meet your precious standards." "Yes," Alex acknowledged. "And you got close to me to seek justice for your father's shop. We both started this with lies, Emma." She turned away, but he continued. "But somewhere between Luigi's restaurant and the farmer's market, between your challenges to my worldview and the way you see beauty in things I'd always dismissed, somewhere along the way, the lies became truth. Alex, I've spent the past week restructuring every development project Sterling Enterprises has undertaken in the last 5 years," he interrupted. "Creating affordable rent programs, small business preservation initiatives. Not because of you, not because of guilt, but because you helped me see what I'd been blind to." Emma finally turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Do you know what it was like? Watching my father's dream crumble? Seeing him lose everything he'd spent his life building?" "No," Alex answered honestly. "I never knew. I never wanted to know. Business was business and people were just numbers on a spreadsheet." He ran a hand through his hair. "God, I was such a fool. And now," he gave a hollow laugh. "Now I can't look at a development proposal without seeing faces. Stories, lives. You did that, Emma. You changed everything." He pulled something else from the folder. A new document. "This is the deed to your father's old building. I'm signing it over to him at the original purchase price, if he wants it." Emma stared at the paper, her hand trembling as she reached for it. "Why?" "Because it's right. Because some things are worth more than money. Because—" He took a deep breath. "Because I love you and I want to be worthy of you. And the bet. I called James this morning, told him to donate the $10 million to the Foundation's small business support program. It was never about the money, Emma. Not really. It was about my pride, my arrogance, my need to prove something." Emma looked up at him, really looked at him, seeing past the polished exterior to the man he'd become, the man she'd helped him become, the man who'd been there all along, waiting to emerge. "I was so angry," she whispered. "For years I carried that anger, planned how I'd make you understand what you'd done. But then I got to know you, the real you, and I fell in love with you too." The admission felt like both a surrender and a victory. Even when I was trying not to, even when I was reminding myself every day why I shouldn't. Alex closed the distance between them, his hands framing her face. "We can't change the past," he said softly, "but we can build something new, something real. No more bets, no more secrets." "No more lies," Emma agreed, her hands reaching up to cover his. "Starting over?" he asked. She shook her head. "No. Continuing, but with truth this time. All of it." Around them, the community center hummed with life. Children laughing, volunteers chatting, the sound of real people living real lives. It was a world Alex had never noticed before Emma, a world she had helped him see and understand. As their lips met, both felt the weight of their secrets finally lifting, replaced by something lighter, truer, and infinitely more precious. The possibility of a future built not on deception or revenge, but on understanding, growth, and love. The Manchester afternoon was grey and drizzly, typical for early winter, but Emma's heart felt lighter than it had in years. She stood beside Alex in front of Clark's Books and Antiques, watching her father's hands shake as he held the new deed to his old shop. "I don't understand," Thomas Clark said, looking between his daughter and Alex. Why would Sterling Enterprises simply return the property? Because it's the right thing to do, Alex replied, his hand finding Emma's and squeezing gently. And because I'm not the same man who took it away. Thomas studied Alex carefully, seeing beyond the expensive coat and cultivated appearance to something genuine in his eyes. Emma tells me you've been making changes in your company. Your daughter helped me understand that true success isn't just about profit margins. Alex gestured to the street around them. Every shop here represents someone's dream, someone's legacy. I was blind to that before. The bell above the shop door chimed as Luigi stepped out, carrying a tray of espresso. He'd insisted on catering this small gathering, flying in from London specifically for the occasion. In my country, he said, passing out the tiny cups, we say that good business is like good cooking. It needs heart, not just ingredients. Emma watched as her father and Alex fell into conversation about plans for the shop's reopening. Alex was suggesting modifications to make the space more modern while preserving its historic charm, while her father shared his vision for combining the traditional bookshop with a community reading space. We could partner with local schools, Emma added, warming to the idea. The foundation has programs that could help fund reading initiatives. And Sterling Enterprises will match any community investment, Alex declared, causing both Emma and her father to look at him in surprise. What? I'm allowed to be generous with my own money. The afternoon stretched into evening, and they found themselves at Emma's favorite childhood restaurant, a small family-owned curry house that had somehow survived the neighborhood's changes. Over steaming plates of tikka masala and naan, they continued planning the shop's future. You know, Thomas said, looking at Alex, when Emma was little, she used to say she'd marry a prince who would help save the bookshop. He smiled at his daughter's blush. I suppose she wasn't entirely wrong. Dad, Emma protested, but Alex laughed. I'm hardly a prince, he said, though I'd very much like to help save the bookshop. He paused, glancing at Emma. And as for the marriage part, Emma's heart skipped a beat. Alex, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. I was going to wait, plan something elaborate, but he opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant vintage ring. This belonged to my grandmother. She was the only person who ever told me that money wasn't everything. I think she'd approve of who I'm giving it to. Alex, Emma breathed, staring at the ring. Are you... No bet this time, he said softly. No ulterior motives, just me, asking the woman I love to marry me. Not because of any wager, but because you make me want to be better. Because you showed me what really matters in life. Thomas quietly excused himself, pulling Luigi with him to give them privacy. Emma looked at the ring, then at Alex's hopeful face. You know this won't be easy, she said. We come from different worlds. We did, Alex agreed, but you've shown me a better world, a real one. And I'd rather live in your world than go back to mine. The tabloids will have a field day. Let them. I'm more interested in what Luigi thinks. He's already planning our wedding menu, by the way. Emma laughed, tears sparkling in her eyes. You're sure about this, about us? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. He took her hand. Emma Clark, will you marry me? Not for a bet, not for revenge, but because somehow in the middle of all our lies we found something true? Emma looked into his eyes, seeing the man she'd fallen in love with, not the arrogant businessman she'd first met, but the caring, changed person he'd become. The man who'd not only acknowledged his mistakes, but was actively working to right them. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes! As Alex slipped the ring onto her finger, they heard cheering from the restaurant entrance. Luigi was crying openly while her father beamed. Other diners, complete strangers, joined in the applause. To new beginnings, Thomas raised his glass. To love, Luigi added emotionally. To truth, Alex said, looking at Emma. She smiled, touching her grandmother's locket, which now held a new photo alongside the old one, a picture of her and Alex at the farmer's market, both laughing, both real. To all of it, she said. The mistakes that brought us together, the truth that almost tore us apart, and the love that made us better. Outside, the Manchester rain had stopped, and a soft evening light bathed the street in gold. Through the restaurant window, they could see Clark's Books and Antiques waiting to begin its new chapter. Just like them. Spring had transformed London into a canvas of colour, cherry blossoms dotting the streets where Emma and Alex now walked hand in hand. The past few months had been a whirlwind of changes, both personal and professional, as they prepared not just for their wedding, but for their new life together. "Are you sure about this?" Emma asked, looking up at the imposing building that housed Sterling Enterprises headquarters. "Absolutely," Alex replied, leading her through the revolving doors. "If you're going to be my wife, you should also be my partner in everything, including this." The board members were already assembled in the conference room, their curious glances taking in Emma's presence. She smoothed down her simple but elegant blazer, a concession to the corporate environment she was entering. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alex began, standing at the head of the table, "I'd like to introduce Emma Clark, who will be joining us as the new Director of Community Impact and Sustainable Development." A murmur ran through the room. Richard Blackwood, still on the board despite his obvious disapproval of Alex's recent changes, spoke up. "With all due respect, Sterling, isn't this a bit personal?" "Everything is personal, Richard," Alex replied calmly. "That's precisely what Emma taught me. Every business decision we make affects real people, real communities. It's time our company reflected that understanding." Emma opened her laptop and began her presentation. She'd spent weeks preparing this, working with community leaders and small business owners to develop a comprehensive plan for sustainable urban development that would benefit both the company and the communities they served. "Our pilot program in Manchester has already shown promising results," she explained, bringing up charts showing increased community engagement and long-term tenant retention. "By preserving local businesses and maintaining affordable rents, we actually increase the overall value of our properties through community stability and organic growth." As she spoke, Alex watched her with undisguised pride. This was the woman he loved, brilliant, passionate, and determined to make a difference. The board members leaned forward, increasingly engaged as she laid out her vision for the future of Sterling Enterprises. After the meeting, back in Alex's office, Emma collapsed onto his sofa. "That was terrifying." "You were amazing," he said, sitting beside her. Even Blackwood looked impressed by the end. "Speaking of endings," Emma pulled out her tablet, "Luigi's been texting me non-stop about the wedding menu. I think he's prepared enough food to feed all of London." Alex laughed, pulling her closer. "Let him. He's already declared himself our official caterer for life. And the guest list. James is still begging to be best man, despite everything. Says he deserves credit for bringing us together." Emma smiled, thinking of how far they'd come from that first meeting at the charity gala. "He's not entirely wrong." "Your father called this morning," Alex mentioned, playing with her engagement ring. "The bookshop renovation is ahead of schedule. He wants to know if we'd consider having the wedding reception there." Emma's eyes lit up. "In the shop, really?" "Once it's finished, yes. He thought it would be symbolic. The place where your family's story almost ended, becoming the place where our new story begins." Tears pricked at Emma's eyes. "When did you become so poetic?" "I believe someone once told me that business and life both need a bit of heart, not just cold calculations." He kissed her softly. "You taught me that." Later that evening, they walked through Borough Market after closing hours. Alex had purchased the entire market building, but instead of the luxury development originally planned, it was being renovated to preserve its historic character while providing modern amenities for the vendors. "Remember our first date here?" Emma asked, stopping by the cheese stall now closed for the day. "I remember thinking you were trying to prove a point by bringing me here." Alex smiled. "I didn't realize then that you were showing me what I'd been missing all along." "And what was that?" "Life, real life, not the sanitized, exclusive version I'd trapped myself in." He turned to face her. "You know, that bet was the best mistake I ever made. And my revenge plan was the best one that ever failed," Emma added with a laugh. They continued their walk, passing the community center where they'd finally confronted their truths, past Luigi's restaurant where they'd had their first real date, and finally to their new home, a surprising compromise between Alex's luxury preferences and Emma's more modest tastes. 3 weeks, Emma mused as they settled onto their balcony. 3 weeks until the wedding. "Having second thoughts?" Alex teased, though she caught a hint of genuine concern in his voice. "About marrying you?" "No." She took his hand. "About letting Luigi handle all the catering?" "Maybe. At least we know no one will go hungry." As the sun set over London, they sat in comfortable silence, both reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. A bet, a revenge plan, two people trying to prove something to themselves and others. All of it had somehow led to this moment of perfect understanding. "You know," Emma said softly, "I never thanked you. For what? For changing. For being brave enough to become someone better." Alex kissed her hand. "And I never thanked you for seeing who I could be, even when I was too blind to see it myself." Below them, London pulsed with life. Not just the exclusive clubs and restaurants Alex had once frequented, but the real heart of the city. Small shops closing for the day, families heading home, communities living and growing together. It was a world they now both fully belonged to, together. The ceremony itself had been held in a small chapel nearby, intimate and genuine. Emma had walked down the aisle in a dress that made Alex's breath catch, not because it was the most expensive or fashionable, but because she looked completely, authentically herself. Her father, beaming with pride, had given her away, while James, who had indeed earned his place as best man, had managed to keep his composure until the vows. Now, as the reception began, the bookshop buzzed with an eclectic mix of guests. Corporate executives mingled with local shopkeepers, charity workers chatted with investment bankers, and at the center of it all, the newly married couple danced between the bookshelves. "Mrs. Sterling," Alex murmured in Emma's ear as they swayed to the music. "Ms. Clark Sterling," she corrected with a smile. "I'm keeping both names, remember?" "How could I forget? It was one of your non-negotiable terms, along with making sure Luigi could cater anything he wanted." As if on cue, Luigi appeared with another tray of appetizers, tears still streaming down his face as they had been all day. "More food is tradition." "Everything's perfect, Luigi," Emma assured him, accepting another bite-sized masterpiece. From his spot by the antiquarian book section, Thomas Clark watched his daughter with misty eyes. James joined him, champagne in hand. "Quite a transformation, wouldn't you say?" James nodded toward Alex, who was now happily chatting with some of the market vendors. "In both of them," Thomas agreed. "Though I suspect Emma changed him more than he changed her. She helped him find who he really was," James mused, "behind all that corporate armor." Across the room, Richard Blackwood was examining the shop's new community reading space with surprising approval. "Sterling," he called out. "This multi-purpose design, it's brilliant. The rental yields must be impressive." "Actually," Alex replied, joining him, "we've kept the rates affordable. The real profit is in the community engagement and sustainable growth." He smiled at Emma. "Some things are worth more than immediate returns." The evening progressed like a well-loved story, each moment adding another page to their shared narrative. The cheesemakers from Borough Market had contributed a spectacular cheese tower alongside the traditional cake. Children from the community center's reading program performed a surprise reading of love poems they'd selected from the shop's collection. During a quiet moment, Emma found Alex standing in front of a newly installed plaque near the entrance. It read, "Clark and Sterling Community Books, where every story matters." "Having second thoughts about the name change?" she asked, wrapping her arms around his waist. "No," he said softly. "I like that it represents both of us now, just like everything else we do." They looked around at their gathered guests, the perfect representation of their merged worlds. The corporate elite who now spoke passionately about community investment, the local business owners who had become valued partners rather than obstacles to progress, their family and friends who had witnessed their transformation from reluctant players in a game of deception to partners in something genuine and meaningful. "Do you ever think about how this all started?" Emma asked. "The bet, my revenge plan?" "Sometimes," Alex admitted, "but I prefer to think about where it led us, to think about what's next." "Speaking of what's next," Emma placed his hand on her stomach, still flat but holding their future. Alex's eyes widened. "Are you—" She nodded, tears sparkling in her eyes. "I found out yesterday. I wanted to wait until today to tell you. A wedding gift of sorts." Alex pulled her close, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Around them, the bookshop hummed with life and possibility. The shelves that had once represented a lost dream now stood as testament to renewal and second chances. "I love you," he whispered. "Not because of any bet, not because of how you changed me, but because of who you are, who we are together." "I love you too," she replied. "The real you, the one who was there all along just waiting to be discovered." As if on cue, Luigi appeared again, this time with tears of joy streaming down his face as he overheard their news. "A bambino, I will prepare special meals for the mother-to-be." Their laughter joined the music and conversation filling the shop, creating a symphony of joy and possibility. Outside, the streets of Manchester were alive with the early summer evening, people going about their lives in the community that Emma and Alex had helped preserve and nurture. The bet that had started it all now seemed like a distant memory, transformed into something far more valuable than £10 million. They had found something real in the midst of pretense, something true in the heart of deception. And now, surrounded by books and love and the promise of new life, they were writing their own story, one without conditions, without pretense, without anything but truth. 1 year later, the autumn sun cast long shadows through the windows of Clark and Sterling Community Books as Emma rocked her infant daughter in the newly added children's corner. Little Rose, named after Alex's grandmother, gurgled happily as she watched the colourful mobile of books spinning gently above her. "Just like her mother," Thomas Clark commented, arranging a display of first editions. "You used to spend hours in this very spot, surrounded by books." The shop had flourished over the past year, becoming more than just a bookstore. It was now a community hub, hosting reading groups, writing workshops and small business seminars. The adjoining cafe, run by Luigi's nephew, filled the space with the aroma of Italian coffee and freshly baked pastries. "Mr. Sterling is here," announced Sarah, now a part-time helper at the shop after Emma had helped her family secure stable housing through the foundation's new initiatives. Alex entered, looking relaxed in a casual sweater, a far cry from his former suited armor. He carried a stack of newspapers, all featuring the same headline: "Sterling Enterprises named most socially responsible corporation of the year." "Have you seen this?" he asked, kissing Emma and then Rose, who reached for him with chubby hands. "I have," Emma smiled. "The board must be pleased with the quarterly results." "Pleased is an understatement. Blackwood actually suggested we expand the community investment program to other cities." Alex shook his head in amazement. "He says it's good for business." "Well, well," Thomas chuckled. "The world really has turned upside down." The bell above the door chimed as James entered, followed by a stream of familiar faces, the cheesemakers from Borough Market, some of the community centre volunteers, and of course Luigi, carrying what appeared to be enough food for a small army. "What's all this?" Emma asked, though she already knew the answer. 1 year ago today, James announced, "I made the best-worst bet of my life, though I'm still not sure who really won." "I think we all did," Alex said, taking Rose from Emma, though not in the way any of us expected. The impromptu gathering turned into a celebration of sorts, with Luigi insisting everyone try his new recipes while sharing stories of the past year's changes. The market vendors talked about the flourishing business under the new community-focused management. The foundation representatives discussed their expanded programs, now supported by Sterling Enterprises' substantial endowment. As evening approached, Emma found Alex in their favorite spot between the philosophy and romance sections, Rose sleeping peacefully in his arms. "Sometimes I still can't believe how much has changed," she said, leaning against him. "I found something today," he replied, pulling an old leather-bound ledger from a shelf. "Your father's original business records." Emma opened it carefully, running her fingers over her father's neat handwriting. The final entries from that difficult time were there, but now they were followed by new ones, records of growth, of community impact, of lives touched and changed. "You know," Alex said thoughtfully, "I used to think success was about numbers, profit margins, market share, but the real measure of success is right here." He looked down at their sleeping daughter, then around at the thriving bookshop filled with friends and community. "It's in the lives we touch, the changes we inspire, the love we share." "Very philosophical," Emma teased. "Maybe we should move this conversation to the business section instead." "I'd rather stay right here, between philosophy and romance. It suits us." Outside, the streets of Manchester were alive with the evening bustle. Through the window, they could see the lights of other shops, and all still there, all still thriving under the new Sterling Enterprises policies. The community they'd helped preserve was growing stronger every day. James raised his glass in a toast. "To the best bet I ever lost. To second chances," Thomas added. "To love and pasta," Luigi declared, making everyone laugh. "To us Alex whispered to Emma. And to all the chapters yet to come. Emma touched her locket, which now held 3 photos, the old shop, their wedding day, and their new family. Each image told part of their story, a story of transformation, of redemption, of love that grew from the most unexpected beginnings. "You know what I think?" she said, watching their friends and family celebrate around them. "I think some stories don't need an ending. They just need the right people to keep writing them." Alex smiled, understanding perfectly. Their story had started with a bet and a plan for revenge, but it had grown into something far more meaningful. It had become a tale of 2 people who found their true selves in each other, who learned that real love doesn't need conditions or pretenses. And as the evening light filtered through the bookshop windows, casting a golden glow over their gathered loved ones, they knew that this wasn't an ending at all. It was simply the beginning of their next chapter.